It's great to be with you here in my favorite city, which I try to get to as often as I can. It was enjoyable to watch Noam Chomsky, whom I've known now actually for 50 years. I started corresponding, not by email, but by post letter in 1962 with MIT, and then came to be a student there in 1965. So that's half a century. I enjoyed his comments. I agreed with much of what he said. I disagreed with a couple things. One thing I agree strongly with are his comments on entrepreneurship as a way of learning. I've gotten involved in that myself. Bringing entrepreneurship into the schools is a theme that I believe strongly in. I started a university called Singularity University with Peter Diamandis of the X Prize Foundation. It's backed by Google and NASA, the American Space Agency. NASA gave us a permanent campus in Silicon Valley. We have about 60 faculty. I'm the chancellor and co-founder. Our last class was 80 students, which we picked from 2,000 applicants. And what we look for in the admissions process is the ability to actually change the world. We're looking for young people who've already changed the world in some way. So a young woman from Nigeria who organized a new way of distributing water in her country is someone we're interested in. A British student who wrote an app for the iPhone with 1 million users is also someone we're interested in, someone who's actually shown they can have an impact on the world. And then we do have courses which cover the kinds of things I talk about: artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, biotechnology, as well as the social, educational, philosophical implications, legal implications of the exponential change and improvement of information technology. But the core of the curriculum are projects that the students self-organize. So teams ranging from 5 to 12 students get together and actually pick a major world problem and apply exponentially growing information technology to solve that problem. And then this project is supposed to continue on indefinitely after the students leave the school, and that has been happening. Many new companies have formed or NGOs to carry on these projects. So for example, one project is to address housing in the developing world by being able to print out little modules, like about this size, that you can snap together Lego style to create a high-quality house using the emerging field of three-dimensional printing. Another project is applying some modern decentralized water purification technologies to create small units that can be distributed widely, that are not centralized, that can overcome the water problem, turn swamp water into clean drinking water. With this technology, we estimated we could solve the water problem in Africa for only a few $1 billion, which is a fraction of the cost of a single dam that moves dirty water from one place to another. But the point is to bring entrepreneurship into the schools, and I think we should do that with high school students and junior high school students, and not as some sort of after-hours extracurricular program, but as something that is the core of education. Because if I think about what I've learned in my life, it's from my own projects. I have a vision and I have a passion to actually accomplish something. Along the way, I actually have to learn a few things, and those lessons have stuck. And we should give then students the tools to actually learn material, find the knowledge they need, mentorship of people who have done these kinds of things before. That's what we do at Singularity University. Look at what young people have already done in the world. Once you get to college, you have a little bit more freedom. So one college kid up near where I live was looking around and wanted a better way of dating girls. And at that time, they had these books that you got every year, and it had little thumbnail pictures printed of all the freshmen. So if you had a blind date with a freshman, you could see what he or she looked like. And it gave you a few clues about them: the Glee Club, likes tennis, and so on. They were called Facebooks. And he said, I could put these online. And then the kids can add their own pictures and they can say who their friends are. That was 2004. And today they have almost 1 billion users. The company is going public with an expected $100 billion market value. It was started by a kid in college. A few years earlier, a couple of students at Stanford in a late-night dorm room challenge used their $1,000 laptops to show that they could actually reverse the links on the internet. You know, all the links go forward. They could actually they were able to figure out a way to reverse them. And they said, hey, you know, that would create a really good search engine. And so that's how Google was born. These are young people that had an idea and a passion, weren't even thinking about changing the world. They followed their own instincts and changed the world. And then these tools are enabling other changes. There was a young man in Egypt with his Facebook account launched the Egyptian revolution. These are very democratizing technologies. I wrote in my first book, which I wrote in the 80s, that the Soviet Union would be swept away by the then emerging decentralized electronic communication, which at that time was early forms of email over teletype machines, fax machines. And I said this would destroy the centralized control that the authorities had relied on by just controlling the central radio and TV station. And people thought that was nuts. A few teletype machines is going to sweep away the Soviet Union, which at that time, when I wrote this, was going strong. But that's exactly what happened in the 1991 coup against Gorbachev. The central authorities grabbed the central radio and TV station. Didn't matter. Everybody was in the know from this clandestine network of hackers who were keeping everybody in the know. These are very democratizing technologies. And it's not just at the political level. A woman walks into a doctor's office with a chronic disease. She's in touch and as part of a community of everyone in the world who has that disease and is armed with a great deal of knowledge about it. And knowledge is power, as Lao Tzu said 2,000 years ago. And right now, in fact, groups of patients are organizing to actually solve diseases. Everyone has the ability to solve problems, including medical technology. In a group of, let's say, 50,000 people who have a particular disease, you're going to have a very wide variety of skills. Collaborative decision-making is proving to be very powerful. And what is driving these changes, and they are accelerating, by the way, is the exponential growth of information technology. In terms of the acceleration, that's one thing I disagreed with Noam Chomsky. He says, well, the changes 100 years ago, like sanitation, were more significant. I mean, that's an apocryphal statement. I've studied the impact and the rate of change. I gave a speech just recently on the 550th anniversary of the University of Basel, which opened its doors 20 years after Gutenberg's invention, not far from where he invented the printing press, and said, well, that's exciting. You must have had some of his books when you opened your doors. And they said, yes, we got them very quickly, only a century later. That is how technology evolved in those days. It took 400 years for the printing press to be adopted by a mass audience. The telephone was relatively quick. It took 50 years to be used by a quarter of the American and European populations. The cell phone did that in 7 years. Social networks, wikis, and blogs did that in 3 years. Sanitation, which Noam Chomsky mentioned, took 100 years to be adopted. It's a great idea. Human life expectancy was 37 in 1800. By 1900, sanitation was fully in place, and it added 11 years. It was 48. By the end of the 20th century, however, with the advent of antibiotics and a few other things, we added 31 years, almost 3 times as much, and it's now 79. It will go into even higher gear when we fully master the information processes underlying biology, and I'll come back to that idea. But technology and the changes that it brings are accelerating. They're getting faster and faster. I mean, just think back, 4 years ago, most people didn't use social networks, wikis, blogs. They're very much part of the fabric of life. It seems like they've always been around. They didn't exist just a few years ago. Think back 10 years ago, most people didn't use search engines. That really sounds like ancient history. We have really offloaded our memories, our historical, social, educational memories to our machines, and people are wary of that kids aren't learning certain things because they're relying on their machines. It reminds me of the controversy when I went to college in the 60s that these little devices about this size had come out called calculators, and educators were concerned that kids wouldn't learn how to do arithmetic. And that was true. Arithmetic skills now are not what they used to be, but the calculators haven't gone away. And these brain extenders we have now are not going away. In fact, they're going to get more powerful. The major theme that I'd like to share with you is that what is driving this acceleration of change is the exponential growth of information technology. And this is not intuitive. We have an intuition about the future. It is an axiom that the only thing that's constant is change. But change is actually not a constant. It's growing exponentially. But when I walked through the savannah 1,000 years ago, or my forebears did, and saw something coming at me, okay, there's an animal going this way, I'm going this way, we're going to meet up there, I better take this other route. So we had predictors in our mind that could actually predict the future. That is actually, if you wonder why do we have a brain, that's why. Because we can predict the future. And it was good for survival. But those predictors are linear, they're not exponential. That animal's going at a certain rate, I assume it's going to continue. That works very well for predicting where an animal will be in 10 seconds. It doesn't work well for the progress of information technology, which progresses not linearly, but exponentially. And I have a whole thesis on why this is the case and a mathematical treatment. But what I'm going to show you is the empirical evidence, which is very strong and very consistent. And I noticed this 30 years ago, made predictions about where, for example, the power of computation per unit currency would be for the next 50 years, and we're very much on that track. It has proven to be very predictive. And what is predictable is that it grows in an exponential manner. Now, what does that mean? It means that it doubles every period of time. That period of time now is 11 months. In fact, the power of computation doubled every 3 years in 1900, every 2 years in 1950. It was 12 months, doubling time in the year 2000. It's now down to 11 months. Even just one level of exponential growth, just doubling, let's say, every year, means that after 30 doublings, it increases by a factor of 1 billion. If I take 30 steps linearly, that's our intuition about the future. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At step 30, I'm at 30. If I take 30 steps exponentially, 2, 4, 8, 16, that reflects the reality of information technology. I get to 1 billion. And it's not a theoretical assessment of the future. This is actually several billion times more powerful per unit currency, per pound or per dollar or per euro, than it was when I was a student at MIT. I actually went to MIT, Noam Chomsky's school, because MIT was so advanced in 1965 that it actually had a computer. It cost tens of millions of dollars. It took up half a building. You needed influence to even get in the building. This is 1 million times cheaper. It is several thousand times more powerful. It's 100,000 times smaller in size. That's a several billion-fold increase of the amount of computation and communication per dollar or per pound since I was a student. We'll do it again because the rate of doubling is getting slightly faster every year in another 25 years. This will again be 1 billion times more powerful per pound. It will be another 100,000 times smaller. It'll be the size of a blood cell. And when these technologies reach certain price performance points, whole new applications explode on the landscape. Search engines weren't feasible up until 10 years ago. We just didn't have the computation and communication to do it. Social networks weren't feasible till maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago. And as the technology reaches certain points, whole new applications become possible. And that exponential growth is not just applicable to these devices we carry around. Each area undergoes a transformation from being a pre-information technology to becoming an information technology. An example of a very important field that's undergoing that transformation now, which I mentioned earlier, is health and medicine, biology. It didn't used to be an information technology. We would just discover things like sanitation or antibiotics. Were discovered quite accidentally. We just stumble upon them. Oh, here's something that lowers blood pressure. We don't really know why this works. Invariably, these found tools had lots of side effects, but they had some benefits, and we would do a cost-benefit analysis. And medicine was really an organized grab bag of these things that we had accidentally discovered. Drug development was called drug discovery, so we would systematically go through, the drug companies would have lists of 20,000 compounds, and they would literally go through every one looking for something that kills HIV or lowers blood pressure and so on. We really didn't have an information theory of how biology works. Now, biology is an information process. There's data coded in DNA that produces linear strings of amino acids. The amino acids fold up into proteins. The proteins interact with three-dimensional atomic interactions. All of that is an information process. But we didn't even have the object code of biology until 2003. By the way, that project, the Human Genome Project, was a perfect example of the exponential growth I'm talking about. When the project was announced in 1990 that we would sequence the entire human genome, you probably think that was a big announcement and a mainstay of science because we now see it as a very important project. But it was actually a renegade project, kind of a fringe group, was not taken seriously. Mainstream scientists said, there's no way you're going to sequence the entire human genome in 15 years. We just had our best PhD students on most advanced equipment, and around the world, in 1989, we sequenced 1/10,000th of the genome. This is going to take centuries. Halfway through the project, the skeptics were going strong, saying, I told you this wasn't going to work. Here you are halfway through a 15-year project, and you finish 1% of the project. 1%, 7 years, it's going to take 700 years, just like we said. Maybe it'll speed up a little, 200 years. The project, though, had been doubling every year, and that continued. The amount of genetic data sequenced continued to double. 1% is only 7 doublings from 100%. Indeed, it was finished 7 years later, much to people's surprise. That has actually continued since the end of the Genome projects. Other projects to understand how genes express themselves in proteins and simulate how proteins interact with each other and actually predict that is also advancing exponentially. So we can now sit down at workstations and actually design a molecule that kills HIV or that stops atherosclerosis or interferes with cancer stem cells and so on. Health and medicine used to be like tool making before we could actually fashion tools. Like, okay, here's this stone to make a good hammer. We couldn't actually shape the tools to do a job. Now we can actually sit down with an understanding of how biology works, which is still incomplete, but advancing exponentially, and actually design these interventions. One aspect of that, for example, stem cell therapies, is advancing very quickly. There's many different therapies that are actually reaching now clinical practice right at the edge. They're actually not legal in the United States. I don't think they're legal in England, but you can go to Israel or some other countries, and for example, if you have a heart attack, half of the survivors will have a damaged heart and will undergo heart failure. My father had this condition in the 60s, and they have a low ejection fraction, and they can hardly walk. You can now get stem cell therapies basically injected into the heart, and it completely rejuvenates the heart, and they then have a normal ejection fraction. And I know people that could hardly walk and now have been rejuvenated. Every single organ in the body, including portions of the brain, are being rejuvenated in this way. We've overcome the ethical dilemma of embryonic stem cells by being able to create the equivalent of embryonic stem cells from your skin cells. So we take skin cells, we reprogram them by adding 4 genes and create what are called IPCs, induced pluripotent cells. which are absolutely the equivalent of embryonic stem cells, but there was no embryo involved. And the ethicists who were opposed to embryonic stem cell research because it involved the destruction of embryos support this because there are no embryos involved. And anyway, if you want a new liver, you'd like it grown from cells that have your DNA, not the DNA of some other embryo. Also, embryonic stem cells are very hard to come by. You have plenty of skin cells. You have an unlimited supply of these. So we could talk for hours about this, but my main point is that health and medicine, at least the research phase for creating new interventions, is now an information technology. So whereas it used to be hit or miss, which meant it progressed linearly, that was useful. Life expectancy was 20 1,000 years ago. I gave a speech recently to middle school kids, and I said, you all would be senior citizens if it hadn't been for the progress that we've made. I was 37, so I think most of you would be senior citizens if this was 1800. It's now pushing 80, but this is going to go into high gear as we really reach the fruits of being able to reprogram biology. And these technologies, which are in an early stage today, will double in power. They will be 1,000 times more powerful in 10 years, 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years, and it will be a very different era. So since our time is limited, let me show you quickly just how pervasive this exponential growth is in many different aspects of information technology, and we can talk some more about the implications. So this is what I wanted to cover today. Any questions on any of this? Okay, I'll go a little more slowly. And I covered some of this, so I'll skip some of these slides. Well, here's one example. Martin Cooper invented a device you may be familiar with, the mobile phone. And he has studied the number of bits we send around wirelessly in the world. So 100 years ago, this was Morse code over AM radio. Today, it's 4G networks. This is I'm talking about the graph on the right. This is a logarithmic scale. As we go up the scale, we're not adding to something, we're multiplying by powers of 10. So every labeled level on that is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. It's a logarithmic scale. And that's the last century. And a straight line on a logarithmic scale means exponential growth. And just look at how smooth and predictable that exponential growth is. And what that is measuring is the number of bits we move around wirelessly in the world. And as it reaches new levels, communication takes on a different character. Now I'll show you the first graph that I came up with. I fashioned myself an inventor since I was 5, but I quickly realized that the key to being successful is not just getting your gadgets to work, but timing. You have to be in the right place at the right time. Larry Page and Sergey Brin had this idea about creating a better search engine. They did it exactly the right time. So I wanted some way of anticipating where technology would be. So I began to study technology trends. The common wisdom is that you can't predict the future. That's still true for specific projects. In fact, even if you were able to see that the enabling factors for search engines were coming into place 12, 14 years ago, the fact that it would be these couple of kids at Stanford that would take over the world of search was not so clear. There were 30 projects to do that. So I began to actually collect a lot of data. Being an engineer, I like data. And this is the first graph where I noticed this exponential growth. Well, I had it up through 1980. And this is the power of computers per unit currency. This is measured in instructions per second per constant dollar. And this is, again, a logarithmic scale. Every level on this graph is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. So that represents trillions-fold increase in the amount of computation you can get per dollar from the 1890 American census up through 1980. And what is really remarkable is it's a very smooth, very predictable curve. Nothing affected it. The Great Depression in the United States and Europe had no impact on it. World War I, World War II, the Cold War. None of the great events of the 20th century had any impact on this. People say, well, you can't just, one of the criticisms of my critics is Kurzweil takes these exponentials and projects them out. And you can't project exponential growth forever. It eventually will die out. Well, what happens in information technology is that specific paradigms do run out of steam at a certain point, but they create research pressure to create the next paradigm, the next method. Moore's law, people say, oh, this is Moore's law. Well, Moore's law is actually just the part of the graph on the right. Moore's law had just started when I looked at this in 1980. Moore's law is shrinking the components on an integrated circuit, on a chip each year, so you can put more of them on a chip. Basically, you can double the number of components every 2 years. They run faster, so you're doubling the power of the chip every 1 year for the same cost. But that was not the first, but the fifth paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. In the 1950s, they were building computers out of vacuum tubes. CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower, the first time the American networks did that, in 1952. They did that with a vacuum tube-based computer. And then every year, they were making the vacuum tube smaller and smaller. Finally, that hit a wall. They couldn't shrink the vacuum tubes anymore and keep the vacuum. And that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the end of the exponential growth of computing. It just went to a whole different approach, to transistors, and then finally to chips. And aside from this very smooth growth, this represents trillions-fold increase. I then took that graph and projected it out actually through the year 2050. We're now in 2012, and we're very much on that curve that I laid out 30 years ago. So this is not just overfitting to past data. Those of you involved with statistical analysis will understand what that means. So there's many different examples in electronics. You could buy a transistor for $1 in 1968. You can get 1 billion of them today for $1. They're actually better because they're smaller, therefore they're faster. But that curve on the top, look at how smooth a progression that is. You would think it would be very erratic, because what is it that we're predicting here? What this is measuring is innovation, entrepreneurship, creativity. You would think that would be very unpredictable. Indeed, each specific project is unpredictable. The overall effect of millions of people doing these activities is highly predictable. We see another example in science of predictable results from unpredictable elements. Take thermodynamics, which predicts the future properties of a gas. And this comes from the 19th century. It actually models each particle as following a random walk. So by definition, you can't tell where this molecule will be in 10 seconds. It's random. Yet the overall gas, made up of a very large number of these particles, has very predictable properties to a very high degree of precision according to the laws of thermodynamics. And it's a similar process here. If there were 4 people in the world working on computers, it would be unpredictable also. But the fact that it's more like 4 million people contributing in some way to some aspect of the technology, the overall results are highly predictable. Economists are actually worried about this. If you can actually get the same information technology today for half the price of last year. And so people assume, well, they're not going to double their consumption year after year, so the overall economic impact in dollars, not bits, is going to shrink, because we'll increase our consumption, but not double it year after year in every area of information technology, and that those areas are expanding. It turns out we do better than that. This is bits shipped of memory, but I could put up 50 other graphs like this. As the price performance improves, we actually more than double our consumption. In every area of information technology, our consumption is 18% greater than the year before, as measured in constant currency, despite the fact you can get twice as much of it each year for half the price. You can buy an iPhone today that's twice as good, twice as powerful, twice as much memory, twice as speed as the one 2 years ago for half the price. That's a 4-fold increase in price performance, and it has led to growth in Apple. And it's not just that Apple is so clever. This is true in every area of information technology. So biotechnology, this is a very powerful concept. We could talk all day or for the entire conference about this, but it's just one example of many of an area that didn't used to be an information technology that is now becoming one. And there's many different aspects of biology that are growing in this exponential manner as we actually treat it as an information technology. Communication technology, very democratizing, as I mentioned. This is internet data traffic, doubling, the number of bits on the internet doubling every year, very smoothly. And this graph on the left is one I had in the early 80s. So that was actually just about 3 or 4 points on that graph, and I projected it out and said, wow, this is going to be a World Wide Web. Didn't use that name, called it Worldwide Decentralized Electronic Communication. By the mid to late 1990s, it will connect hundreds of millions of people. And in my book, Age of Intelligent Machines, which came out at the end of the 1980s, I described in detail how that would revolutionize education. Kids would be together on social networks, sharing information, and so on. People thought that was nuts when the entire American defense budget could only tie together 2,000 scientists in a year in 1982. But that's the power of exponential growth. The graph on the right is the same data, but on a linear scale rather than a logarithmic scale, and that's how we actually experience the world. So to the casual observer, it looked like the World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s, but you could see it coming. We're shrinking technology at an exponential rate. This is the cover of your fine magazine about a year ago. Has a picture of a violin that was printed out on a 3-dimensional printer, and it actually plays quite well, and professional violinists like it. Right now, you can print out objects made from a wide variety of materials in 3 dimensions, including devices that have very intricate internal mechanical mechanisms. The scale of precision is in microns, which is millionths of a meter. That's pretty good for a lot of things, like a violin. It's not good enough, let's say, for biological materials like clothing. But the scale is improving at a rate of 100 in 3D volume per decade. This will be nanotechnology by the 2020s, and we'll be able to print out just about anything. This follows a trend where we're turning physical objects into information objects. If I wanted to send you a book or a movie or a sound recording, an album, a few years ago, I'd send you a postal package. Today, I can send you an email attachment, and you can turn it into those products. I can also send you a violin as an email attachment if you have a 3-dimensional printer. Those are still a little bit expensive, but not that bad. If you remember paper printers, well, I remember I sold my first company to Xerox, which is now Nuance, because I spun it out as a public company. Nuance created Siri, which is a personal assistant on your iPhone. And I was given a tour in 1981 of the advanced Xerox technology, and they took me into the room, and they said, this is the future of printing. And I went into this big room, and there was a laser printer, which cost about $1 million. And it could print out, I think, 100 pages per minute. Today, laser printers are $80, $79. Same thing is happening with these 3D printers. They used to be tens of thousands of dollars, and now thousands of dollars. They will be hundreds of dollars within 5 years. And you can print out a wide variety of things. With your 3D printer today, you can print out 70% of the parts you need to print out another 3-dimensional printer. That will be 100% within 5 to 10 years. This will revolutionize manufacturing ultimately, including the size limit is something like about this big, but you can print out large objects by snapping them together Lego style. Somebody actually designed with computer-assisted design and printed out with a 3-dimensional printer an airplane and flew in it. And I mentioned we have a project to print out houses the same way. So this physical objects are becoming an information technology as well. Time magazine had a cover story on my law of accelerating returns, which is what I'm talking about, the exponential growth of information technology. They said, we want to print your graph, but we'd like you to update it, and here's a computer we actually covered in the magazine a few weeks ago. We want you to include this. And I said, well, okay. I didn't know if it actually would be on the curve or below it, because sometimes you have a computer that has other things, like maybe it has furniture, and therefore its price performance will be below the current state of the art. It's never above it, not if a company wants to stay in business, but it actually was right on the curve. This is a curve I laid out 30 years ago. It's the last dot on there. But this is going to continue to revolutionize the impact of information technology. I'm writing a book right now called How the Mind Works and How to Build One, about what we understand about how the brain works. And we understand actually a lot more than people realize. A common criticism is that, okay, well, Kurzweil's right that hardware is progressing exponentially, but software is stuck in the mud. That's something I've studied quite extensively, and it's not true. For example, there was recently a major study on just this issue by the Scientific Advisory Board to President Obama that looked at the impact of computer hardware versus computer software on a wide range of scientific and engineering problems. And they came up that overall the improvement was about 16 million to 1, 1,000 to 1 improvement from hardware over the last 15 years. 16,000 times improvement from improvements in algorithms and software. They multiply together, so you get overall 16 million to 1, but there was more improvement in software than in hardware. We can also see tremendous impact in terms of software. That's really impressive. How many people have heard of the IBM computer Watson that played and won the Jeopardy game? Yeah, a few of you heard about that. That's actually very impressive. I wrote in the early 80s that a computer would take the World Chess Championship by 1998. And I also predicted that when that happens, we would immediately dismiss chess as not being very important. And so then both of those things happened in 1997 when Deep Blue defeated the human champion Kasparov. And then people immediately said, well, it's not such a big deal because chess is just a logic game. And of course, computers are a logic machine. So we would expect them to do very well at chess. But what they'll never be able to do is actually deal with the subtleties and vagaries and ambiguities of human language. Well, that's why Watson is very significant, because to play Jeopardy, you have to deal with the vagaries of human knowledge. The Jeopardy queries are filled with metaphors and puns and jokes and similes and very convoluted forms of human knowledge. And what is generally not appreciated is that the knowledge that Watson has to then respond to the query, to answer the query, once it figures out, okay, we got to find some queen in Norway in the 16th century who had blonde braids, was not hand-coded by the scientists. It got that by actually reading Wikipedia and several other encyclopedias, just the normal text. It takes a lot of intelligence to understand what those sentences mean and what is being conveyed in those natural language documents. It read millions of documents like that. And Noam Chomsky actually commented on Watson saying, well, it's not true AI. if what he means by that is that it's not strong AI, meaning it's not at human levels, I agree with that. It's actually below human levels in being able to understand human language. How then could it actually get a higher score than the best two human players in the world combined? It's because it's combining some level, it's pretty good, of understanding human language with a capacity of sort of total recall and very rapid operation that computers had. I mean, you and I could read Wikipedia too. I actually figured out it would take a few years. Of course, it will have doubled by the time we finish, so I'm not sure we'd ever finish. But even assuming we could finish, we wouldn't remember very much of it. You wouldn't be able in 3 seconds to come up with anything that was in Wikipedia. That's something that Watson can do. anything it read, it can come up in a second or two. So that's an advantage of machine intelligence. The ability to actually understand all these levels of hierarchy is improving as well, and it's actually improving at an exponential rate. Other critics of Watson have said, well, it's doesn't really have true understanding of what it's reading, it's just doing statistical analysis. Well, if statistical analysis of language does not represent true understanding, then the human brain has no true understanding either, because that's exactly how the human brain works. It uses techniques that are very analogous to the methods in Watson. We could talk a long time about how Watson works and what it represents and the whole field of natural language understanding, but it's an impressive display or demonstration of artificial intelligence today. And one of the comments I'll make on that is the goal here is not to displace human thinking, but to amplify it. And we've all experienced that right now. I mean, Wikipedia went on strike for a day a few days ago, and I felt like a part of my brain had gone on strike, because literally my brain is amplified and expanded by all of these tools. It makes me smarter. I have work groups now with 3 or 4 people can do in a matter of weeks what used to take 100 people years. We are more productive and smarter because of these tools. They are mind expanders. As these tools get more intelligent, for example, search engines can deal with more than just finding keywords, but actually understanding, let's say, a substantive question and really understanding what it's reading. And that's coming because Watson does that. There will be even more powerful tools. IBM is working with Nuance, which used to be Kurzweil Computer Products, my first company, the company that created Siri, to create a special version of Watson that will have read and will continue to read all medical literature. Every journal article comes out, all the important medical blogs, and will be a master medical diagnostician and consultant. And so doctors can feed in the information about a particular patient, get a diagnosis, interact with Watson as to what an appropriate treatment would be. It's really intended to be an amplification of human thought. So I am coming out with a book on this topic. So let me just deal with one more point, and then I'll leave a few minutes for questions, which is this good or bad for humanity? And it might seem apparent to some that's a good thing, but there's actually a strong train of thought, or school of thought, that says technology is hurting society. Certainly some technologies, like fossil fuels, have been a mixed bag. They allowed our economies to develop, but also have harmed the environment. But how are we doing overall? A lot of people don't really have a good conception of what life was like. I invite people to read Thomas Hobbes, who described life a couple hundred years ago as short, brutish, disaster-prone, disease-filled, poverty-filled, or Charles Dickens. But I've put together, I have about 30 or 40 graphs like this. I'll just show you one sample graph. This deals with how we're doing on wealth and health. So on the x-axis here, it's the average wealth per capita of nations. So each of these little circles is a country. The big red circle is China. And on a logarithmic scale, it's the per person GDP, actually income per person, in today's dollars, even though this is 1800. And it was in hundreds of dollars per person. Some countries are wealthier than others, but they're all in the hundreds of dollars. On the x-axis, it's longevity, and it ranges from the 20s to the 30s. The average, as I mentioned, was 37. So let's see what happens over the last 200 years. It's supposed to show the date. You can't see that, but this is, you can see it down there below. So this is the 19th century. Things are starting to heat up with the late stages of the Industrial Revolution. And China does some interesting things, if you watch it. But there's a wind that carries these nations towards the upper right-hand corner of the graph. There's a have-have-not divide. The have-have-not divide persists. But this is a snapshot of today. The countries that are worst off are far better off than the countries that were best off at the beginning of this process. And this the movement is not towards the lower left. The movement is towards the upper right. That's going to continue and actually, in my view, accelerate due to the fact that more and more things are becoming an information technology. We could print, in 10 years, we can ship one three-dimensional printer to Nigeria, and they can then print out another one. The 2 can print out 4, and the 4 can print out 8, and pretty soon everybody can have a three-dimensional printer, which will turn very inexpensive input materials into the most of the physical things you need, from clothing to housing. It's just one example of what will be feasible. There's another thing that's important, is that it's a mistake to just measure economies in dollars, because this costs a couple $100, but it's actually worth about $1 trillion in terms of the computation and communication of several decades ago. And that's completely factored out. So in a large way, we are better off just from that factor. But this would bear more discussion. I'll show you just one last graph, and having to do with longevity. This is a demonstration. This is the progress we've made from technology over the last 1,000 years. But this is going to go into high gear as we get into the more advanced stages of the exponential growth of information technology and biology. And we're also going to make ourselves wealthier in the process. But in terms of education, we need to really teach kids how to solve problems. And as Noam Chomsky said at the end there, to give that child who has a passion for a particular subject the freedom to pursue that. That's material that she will remember for a lifetime, and she'll learn the skills of how to solve problems that she encounters for a lifetime. That's, in my view, is what education should be all about. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for...
Yes, we have time for some questions. We have some microphone runners, and we'll be running around just for a second to grab questions. I'd like to ask one small question first. Actually, maybe it's a big question, but just while the right runners get it going. The exponential thing, I've been following this whole argument for a while, and it certainly influenced a lot of my thinking. I mean, is there an end point to this? Does it just carry on going ad infinitum? And how, if that's the case, given where you believe we'll be in 2030, which is when my daughter, my 6-year-old, will enter the workplace as an adult, how do we prepare an education system for that, for her to enable her to operate in that environment?
Well, as a theoretical matter, I deal with, is there an ultimate limit to the ability, for example, to keep increasing computation and communication based on what we know about the laws of physics? There's been a lot of discussion, Moore's law is going to come to an end. But if you speak to Justin Ratner, the CTO of Intel, he'll tell you, yes, flat integrated circuits, which is what Moore's law is about, are going to peter out in around 2015, 2017, but we will switch over to three-dimensional circuits. That will enable us to keep going for many decades, actually to the late 21st century. I talk about what the ultimate limits are based on the laws of physics for computation and communication. It's actually vanishingly little resource needed to compute a bit or transmit a bit of information. So yes, there's actually a limit, but the limit is so vastly beyond anything that we experience today that it's not something we need to worry about. We'll be able to expand our own intelligence billions-fold with the technology that we can see in front of us. And in terms of what we should do in education, I mean, we're already long past the point where we should be enthusiastically taking advantage of the educational opportunities for children to learn from each other and from experts and adults all over the world. Kids do that anyway. The fact that think you mentioned your daughter can't take her iPad to school. I mean, that's foolish. It's a very powerful educational tool. But entrepreneurship, I think, is very important, and it should not just be some, club that's after hours. That should be a mainstay of education. I'm not saying everything can be learned that way, but that should be a very powerful educational experience. For kids to have a passion for something, to pursue that passion, they'll learn a lot along the way. That's, whatever I remember from what I've learned, it's been from my own projects.
Some questions from the audience. If we could have a mic runner down here, please. Thank you, Raj. If you could just say your name, where you're from, and a very brief question, please.
Okay, my name is David Wortley. I'm an independent consultant. Very briefly, you and I are from the baby boomer generation. I'd like to challenge, as you did, what Noam said about this being previous inventions having more impact on society. The thing I'd like to put to you is that I was born into an age where human beings use their skill and intelligence to get the best out of technology. I believe now that we're in an unprecedented age where machines and technology are using their skill and intelligence to get the best from human beings. Your view on that?
Well, we're always building on the shoulders of what's come before us, so we certainly owe a lot to 20th century and before that 19th century and before that 18th century innovators. There weren't very many 18th century innovators. You probably have heard the names of all of them. The word science hardly existed a few hundred years ago, and there were very few people who practiced it, and there were very few people that practiced or had the opportunity for what we would consider a liberal education today. So these technologies are growing exponentially. The pace of change and adoption is getting far faster. It took literally centuries, like four of them, for innovations like the printing press to be adopted. Certainly that was a significant invention. Before that, some tens of thousands of years ago, written language was a significant invention. That took thousands of years to be adopted. So I've written a lot in my books about this. It is a grand sweep. As we can measure the information properties of a technology, we see exponential growth, and that's not intuitive. Our intuition is linear, as I mentioned.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Gentleman at the back there, please.
Hi, it's Rich Boakes from University of Portsmouth. You've talked about self-replicating machines and the emergence of artificial intelligence. If we have this event horizon in the future where we have machines that can generate themselves and are also intelligent, at what point does humanity become pointless anyway? At what point do machines matter more?
Well,
and how do we stop that?
If we look at the trends, these technologies are very widely distributed. They're not being enjoyed simply by some elite. People say, oh, only the wealthy and very few people, only an elite are going to have these powerful technologies. And I say, yeah, like cell phones. In fact, when Martin Cooper invented the mobile phone, very few people had them. And if you remember in the movies of maybe 20 years ago, if someone took out a mobile phone, that was a signal that this person was a member of the power elite. And they didn't work very well. You didn't take them out of your pocket. They were quite large and heavy and did one thing poorly, which was make calls. Today they do, well, a million things according to the Apple ads. And they are very powerful expanders of our minds. There are 5 billion cell phones and counting. There's about 1 billion smartphones. All of that's growing exponentially. Google expects that there'll be 6 billion smartphones within a few years. So these technologies are very widely distributed, and they are amplifying our technologies. I mean, this is not some alien amplifying our own intelligence. These are not alien invasions from Mars of smart machines to displace us and take us over. We create these tools to make ourselves smarter and to expand our capabilities. In my view, it's part of the human civilization. I mean, this is part of who I am. The fact that it's not yet inside my body and brain is, I think, a distinction without a difference. I'd like it to be inside my body. I wouldn't lose it that way as often. And that this will be the size of a blood cell in 25 years, and they will make their way into our bodies and brains. There are people walking around with computers connected in their brains right now, Parkinson's patients, for example. There are computerized devices being developed for every organ in the body. We are going to merge with these technologies. It's part of who we are. We're the only species that extends our reach with our tools. No other species does that. So it's part of being human. And we're going to, very intimately expand our intellectual and physical powers as we've already started to do with these technologies. Thank you very much.